recording button. Otherwise, I occasionally forget, and that's never a good thing. It's straight up 12 noon right now. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Beef on Dairy Dialogue. It is an extension of the Dairy Beef Short Course, which we have every March. Today's topic is the economics of beef on dairy cattle in the feedlot. Melanie Concepcion is a PhD student at Michigan State University, working with Dan Buska. She obtained her BS from the University of Puerto Rico in animal science and an MSc in animal science from Michigan State University, concentrating on beef cattle management. Her research evaluates feedlot performance, carcass traits, liver issues, and the economics of beef and dairy, beef on Holstein and Holstein cattle. We appreciate you coming to this webinar, Melanie, and being willing to share this information. As I always say, the podium is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Fred. So I have a little outline of what I'll be discussing today. I'll start out with a little bit of relevance, why we are studying beef on Holstein cattle. I'll be doing that by discussing two projects where we compared performance, carcass traits, and economics of beef on Holstein and Holstein steers. I'll wrap it up with a summary and then give you a little brief look into our current research. And so I know that you all know the difference between dairy and beef cattle. However, I always like to start here because since we're studying and comparing beef on Holsteins, this is where we need to start. And we know that dairy cattle have been intensively selected for milk production, which has resulted in animals with less muscling and a more angular conformation, which is something that we also see when we look at their steaks and ribeyes later on at the consumer side. And when we look at beef cattle, these ones have been intensively selected for beef production, which has resulted in cattle with a greater muscle expression and a more stocky conformation. And again, at the consumer side, we see the differences in their ribeyes and steaks. So when we think about beef on Holsteins, we might expect them to be more in between of these cattle, but that's what we wanted to see. And so why beef on Holsteins? Dairy producers have been breeding their lower milk production cows to beef sires to increase calf revenue. And this is because producers may be able to add value to the existing Holstein steers by making them more desirable in terms of muscling and hide, as they can potentially obtain premiums from programs such as certified Angus beef. So the overarching idea is that we're taking the existing Holstein calf and adding more value to it by breeding it to beef. And as we can see here with these data obtained from cattle facts, with the fed dairy type cattle in yellow and beef on dairy crosses in orange, we can see that from the 2000 until around 2019, million head of dairy cattle in the fed slaughter mix were predominantly made up of just dairy types, so Holsteins mostly. But then around 2019, we start seeing the presence of the beef on dairy crosses in the fed slaughter mix. And this may be because of many reasons. One of the reasons that are attributed to this is Tyson, which is a very big packer, deciding to stop purchasing Holsteins for harvest, and this thereby reduced the competition for Holsteins. And so that's where producers saw the opportunity to introduce beef on Holsteins. They started breeding their dairy dams to beef sires, and they started making up a percentage of that fed slaughter mix. And we see that with time, they have continued to grow because we know that now that we have more information about these beef on dairy crosses, they have greater muscling than the Holsteins. They are on feed for a shorter time, which is something that I'll be discussing later on. But we see that up to 2024, they're making up around 2 to 3 million head of the fed slaughter mix compared to the Holsteins. And Cattle Facts estimates that this is going to continue to grow with time. So they're here to stay, and we're going to continue to see the amount of beef on dairy crosses to grow in the fed slaughter mix. And within that fed slaughter mix of dairy type cattle, we see that they comprise around 15 to 20% of the beef produced in the United States, which is a pretty big percentage. However, when it comes to cost, there is a substantial market value disconnect within the current supply chain for beef on Holstein crossbred cattle. And we don't know how much they should be worth because they can vary substantially in price, with premiums for these crossbreds being high due to their novelty and the opportunity to improve the existing Holstein herd. And we can see here with these data from the state of Kentucky, which is the nearest data market that collects beef on dairy bull calf prices to Michigan, with Holsteins in black and beef on dairy in green, that from 2019 to 2025, beef on dairy bull calf prices were priced at a premium over Holstein bull calf prices. With time, we've seen that the Holstein bull calf price has gone up a little bit. However, that may be because of the short supply of cattle, driving prices higher for calves in general. But we still see that beef on dairy bull calf price at a premium over the Holsteins. Overall, though, we don't know how much these beef on dairy calves should be worth. Should they be worth more or less than the straight bred Holstein calf due to their beef genetics, or should it be less? We don't know if they're over or underpriced. So that led us to our first study, where we decided to evaluate and compare finishing performance, carcass traits, and economics of beef on Holstein and Holstein steers. Our null hypothesis was that health, growth, feed intake, feed efficiency, carcass traits, cost of gain, and carcass value would be improved than beef on Holstein steers when compared with their Holstein contemporaries within the current supply chain. And for this study, we sourced 75 Holstein and 75 beef on Holstein steers from a Michigan calf raiser. However, this calf raiser sourced the cattle from multiple dairies. And as such, we didn't have an understanding of the genetics of the beef and beef on Holsteins. So we ran genomic testing, and we saw that overall, 35% of those beef on Holstein calves were sired by Angus bulls, 39% by Limousin bulls, and 25% by Simmental bulls. And I would like to note that within that Limousin and Simmental percentage, there were also Limousin Angus and Simmental Angus bulls. These calves were at around 4 months old when they arrived to the feedlot, and they were approximately 379 pounds on average. They were blocked by body weight after a 21-day adjustment period, so we selected 120 steers. And we allotted them to 10 pens per breed type. So this was a total of 20 pens and 6 steers per pen. Because these calves were so young when they arrived to the feedlot, we fed them a starter diet that was then transitioned into a finishing diet. And this was done from arrival until around day 21 of the trial. After day 21, they were fully transitioned into a finishing diet that resembled a very typical Midwest diet of high moisture corn silage, distillers, supplement, and limestone. And this diet, as we can see, had a higher energy than the starter diet as well. And all these cattle were fed the same diet regardless of breed type. So moving on to the data we collected for performance, we have tables that start with item, and then we have breed type starting with Holstein, followed by beef on Holstein, and then significant values that we collect running statistics. Overall, we saw that the beef on Holsteins were on feed for a shorter amount of time compared to the Holsteins, which is what we expected. So it was 21 days longer for the Holsteins. We started the cattle on trial at an initial weight that was similar because we wanted to start them on a similar basis. We also saw that average chili gain tended to be greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. Dry matter intake, however, was similar between the breed types on a daily basis. I would like to note that the beef on Holsteins were on feed for a shorter time, so they did eat less overall, but daily it was similar. Feed efficiency was lower for the beef on Holsteins, showing that they were more feed efficient than the Holsteins. And final body weight was greater for the Holsteins compared to the beef on Holsteins. We also decided to look at final hip height due to packer concerns at the time regarding frame size in Holsteins. And we saw that this was greater for the Holsteins. We also looked at frame score, and this was greater for the Holsteins compared to the beef on Holsteins. And this is a 1 to 10 scale. So we did see that the beef genetics helped moderate frame size in the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. We also decided to observe liver abscess incidence between these two in the beef on Holsteins. We were not able to look at it for the Holsteins. However, we did see that our scoring system that goes from healthy to 1 or 2 small abscesses or multiple small or 1 or more large abscesses showed that 61% of the beef on Holstein livers appeared visually healthy. 23% had 1 or 2 small abscesses, which may be a little bit difficult to see here. And 16% of these livers had 1 or more large abscesses, as we can see in this one. In this one, you may not be able to see the abscess because it's under this. So in some cases, these abscesses are so severe that the liver adheres to the carcass, which can incur in trimming losses. And this is very detrimental to the overall carcass value, which is why it's so important for us to study the liver abscess differences between these cattle. But like I said, we don't have it for the Holsteins, but I'll discuss this more later on. This table is also set up similar to the first one I showed. Overall, we saw that for carcass characteristics, hot carcass weight was similar between the breed types, as well as dressing percentage, statistically at least. KPH was also similar. However, when we look at ribeye area, we saw that the beef on Holsteins had a 20% bigger ribeye compared to the Holsteins, showing us that the beef genetics can improve muscling in these cattle. This resulted in a lower yield grade, which, as we know, lower means greater muscling or more yield.
Some random. No, it's some random one that
fat thickness was also greater. I think someone has their mic on. Fat thickness. I think someone has their mic on. Yeah, we're just gonna keep going. So fat thickness was greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, which is expected because beef type cattle have greater fat thickness compared to Holsteins. Marbling score was similar between the breed types. And for this study, we decided to evaluate these cattle at a similar compositional basis, which we did by looking at their carcass empty body fat. So we did this prior to harvest by scanning the cattle by ultrasound and using an equation that helped us determine preliminary empty body fat so we could select harvest dates on a similar basis. And this was on average 28%. It was lower than what we were aiming for, which was 30%, which is why we had lower marbling scores and quality grades. As we can see, our quality grade was more of a low choice to select average. And this shows us that for us to obtain better quality grades and more desirable marbling scores in these cattle, we need to feed them longer. Moving on to our economic analysis, we decided to include our pre-trial days on feed as well to get a full accounting of economic cost and feed and all of that contributed to the overall cost of gain of these cattle. And we saw that overall our purchase cost was $300 greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, which was a lot. We know that they had a premium over these cattle, but this was certainly greater than what it should have been, which you'll see later on. This resulted in a greater interest on the cattle. And as for our feed costs, this included pre-trial feed costs, the starter, a finisher, and the interest on the feed. Overall, this was $100 greater for the Holsteins compared to the beef on Holsteins. And this was predominantly driven by their longer amount of days on feed compared to the beef on Holsteins. As for our non-feed operating costs, these included preventative health, medication, death loss, implants, yardage, which was set at $1 per head per day, transportation to the plant, beef checkoff cost, and this resulted in not really a difference statistically between the Holsteins and beef on Holsteins, because the only difference that we really had here was yardage. But aside from that, all other costs were fairly similar. This resulted in a greater cost of gain for the Holsteins compared to the beef on Holsteins. So overall, we saw that our beef on Holsteins, because they were on feed for a shorter time and had a lower feed cost, had a more desirable cost of gain. Moving on to our carcass value, for this study, we decided to observe different pricing scenarios for the carcass pricing of the beef on Holsteins. So at the time of this study, plants didn't really know how to price beef on Holsteins because some of them could be more beef type, more dairy type, more dairy type, or in between. And so that's why we decided to price the Holsteins as either Holstein with the Holstein base carcass price, beef on Holstein base carcass price, which was the average between the beef base carcass price and the Holstein base carcass price, as beef, or variable. And so this variable pricing scenario was basically, we looked at ribeye tracings of these cattle or these carcasses, and if they looked more beef type, they were priced as beef, so they received the beef base carcass price. Or if they looked more dairy type, they received the beef on Holstein base carcass price. To add on to this, if they had a beef type confirmation and they met up with the certified Angus beef specifications, they also received that premium. That is something that we only did in this scenario and for cattle that had a beef type confirmation and met the specifications. As for the Holsteins were just priced with the Holstein base carcass price, and then they were compared to all these other pricing scenarios. And these are the premiums and discounts in dollars per hundredweight at the time of this study. So we included those for yield grade, quality grades, carcass weight, as well as the certified Angus beef premium, which, like I mentioned, was only used for those that met the specifications in the fourth pricing scenario. So as we can see here, we have Holsteins priced as with the Holstein base carcass price being compared to beef on Holsteins on all four pricing scenarios. So beef on Holsteins that were priced as Holstein did not differ from the Holsteins because the premiums and discounts didn't really drive much difference. However, we see that as we increase that base carcass price, we see a difference from the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. We see the same with beef on Holsteins priced as beef or by body composition. So this shows us that if we want to have a greater carcass value on this beef on Holsteins, they need to have a more beef type confirmation and they need to be priced at a greater value than a Holstein or dairy type carcass price so that we can obtain more value out of them. And this may be something that we can do if we feed them out longer so they have also more marbling and can meet more certified Angus beef specifications, so that in this case, for example, with the fourth pricing scenario, we can get more value out of them. As for carcass revenue, if beef on Holsteins were priced as Holstein or beef on Holstein, they did not differ much from the Holsteins, so it was not different statistically. However, if they were priced as beef or by body composition, they did have a greater revenue compared to the Holsteins. So again, this shows that if we want to add more value to these carcasses, they need to have more beef type conformation so they can have a greater base carcass price, and we can get more revenue. As for our break-even feeder calf value, which is the overarching goal of this study, we wanted to know how much we should actually pay for these calves. We saw that regardless of pricing scenarios, so regardless of if they were priced as Holstein, beef on Holstein, beef, or by composition, beef on Holsteins had a greater break-even feeder calf value compared to the Holsteins. And if we want to magnify this and look at it in terms of dollars per calf, they should have been priced at $102 to $173 per calf greater than the Holsteins. So we see that they should be worth more than the Holsteins. However, they should not have been worth as much as they were, because if you remember that table that I showed you with the purchase cost, we paid $310 more for the beef on Holsteins than for the Holsteins, or compared to the Holsteins. So yes, we should pay more for them, but not as much as we did. But overall, this data did show us that beef on Holstein feeder calves have a greater potential value than Holstein feeder calves. And to summarize that study before we move on to our second study, which this study is actually published in the journal Applied Animal Science, we saw that health and dry matter intake were similar between the breed types. Average daily gain tended to be greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to Holsteins. The beef on Holsteins were more feed efficient and had a greater ribeye area and fat thickness than the Holsteins. They also had a lower yield grade, which is more desirable. They had a lower cost of gain, and they had a greater calf and carcass value compared to the Holsteins. However, we were not able to observe differences in liver abscess incidence, and we did see that the beef on Holsteins had a 39% liver abscess incidence. So we decided to look into the liver abscess issue in the beef on dairy production system, as well as continuing to study these beef on Holstein cattle. And that led us to our second project, where we evaluated the effects of corn silage inclusion rate in the finishing diet on performance, carcass traits, and liver abscess incidence of beef on Holstein and Holstein steers. Liver abscesses are polymicrobial infections that have been typically correlated to ruminal acidosis, and they are the primary reason for liver condemnation of the plant. This can vary by breed type, so it can range from 50 to 80% in Holsteins, 10 to 30% in beef, and 40 to 60% in beef on Holsteins. If we look at this in terms of economics, if we estimate that around 30% of livers are condemned yearly, that is around a $38 million annual loss for the United States, and that is not including performance losses on the producer side or trim and skirt steak losses at the plant side. So this loss can be even greater if we take those into account. So because this liver abscess issue was something that was a concern for producers in terms of beef on Holsteins, we decided to compare feedlot growth, feed efficiency, cost of gain, carcass traits, carcass value, and liver abscess rate of beef on Holstein and Holstein steers fed finishing diets with two different corn silage concentrations. Our hypothesis was that if we increase the inclusion of corn silage in the diet of beef on Holstein and Holstein steers, we would reduce the incidence of liver abscesses. Our idea is that if we increase fiber, which we can do by increasing the amount of corn silage in the diet, we may be able to maintain rumen health, and thereby we can reduce liver abscesses. For this study, we sourced cattle from 2 Michigan calf raisers. They were 65 Holstein and 65 beef on Holstein steers. We also conducted genomic testing to have a better understanding of the genetics of the beef on Holsteins. And overall, we saw that 77% of the beef on Holsteins were sired by Angus bulls, 2% by Limousin bulls, and 19% by Simmental Angus bulls. So we had a predominantly Angus sired herd in this case. They were around 5 to 6 months of age on arrival to the feedlot. And after a 14-day adjustment period, we selected 120 steers and randomly allotted them to pens. And so for this study, we had 2 dietary treatments by 2 breed types. So as you can see, there were 5 pens of beef on Holsteins that were fed a 20% corn silage diet, 5 pens of beef on Holsteins that were fed a 40% corn silage diet, and the same for the Holsteins. So this resulted in beef on Holsteins and Holsteins being fed the 2 different diets, and we allotted them in 5 different pens, so a total of 20 pens. And as we can see here with the diets, they were similar to our first study diet in the sense that they included corn silage, high moisture corn, distillers, and supplement. However, we had either 20% or 40% corn silage inclusion in the diet, and 50 or 30% inclusion of high moisture corn in the diet, with 25% and 5 of distillers and 5% of supplement. I would like to point your attention to the fiber content. As we can see, it was greater in the diet that had a greater amount of corn silage, and that is because of its greater roughish inclusion and lower energy based on the amount of corn silage. And we have seen with research that if we include more roughish and fiber in the diet, we can decrease incidence and severity of liver abscesses. So that was what we wanted to observe in this study. And in this study, because we had beef breed and diet, our tables were set up a little bit differently. So as you can see, we have breed starting with Holstein, followed by beef on Holstein, and diet starting with 20% corn silage, followed by 40% corn silage, and then our significant numbers. In this study, the Holsteins were also on feed longer than the beef on Holsteins, and those that were fed a 40% corn silage diet were also on feed longer than those that were fed 20% corn silage in the diet. Health was not different. As we can see, morbidity was pretty low. We didn't really have any health issues in this study. Initial body weight was not, even though we were aiming for it to be similar, it was not. So we used it as a covariate for all of our subsequent analysis. And we also saw that final body weight was greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, but it was not different between the diets. Average daily gain was also greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, but it was not different between the diets. And dry matter intake was greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, but it was not different between diets either. It tended to be greater for those that were fed more corn silage in the diet, but it was greater for the beef on Holsteins. Feed to gain was similar between breeds and diets. We didn't really see any difference here. So there was no differences in feed efficiency regardless of breed or diet. As for frame score, we also evaluated this to look at differences in frame size. We didn't see them in the diets. However, we did see that the beef on Holsteins had a lower frame size compared to the Holsteins, like our first study, showing us that, again, on a 1 to 10 scale, it was lower, and beef genetics can help moderate frame size in these beef on Holstein cattle. As for liver abscess incidence, we were able to compare them between the breed types and diets. And our scoring system was similar to the first one, where 0 means healthy, A means 1 or 2 small abscesses, and A+ means 1 or more or several big abscesses. We only really saw a difference in those that had 1 or 2 small abscesses. It was greater for the Holsteins. But when we look at the diets, which is what our aim was for, we saw that 40% corn silage, so increasing the amount of corn silage in the diet, effectively reduced the amount of liver abscesses in cattle, regardless of breed, compared to those that were fed more corn silage. So that was the aim of our study, and we did see that reducing or increasing corn silage in the diet can help us reduce the amount of liver abscesses. Moving on to carcass characteristics, this table is set up a little differently than my previous ones because we had interaction between breed and diet. So we're going to see Holstein, starting with those that were fed less corn silage or more corn silage. and then beef on Holstein, and again, 20% or 40% corn silage. Overall, we saw that beef on Holsteins, regardless of diet, had a greater hot carcass weight compared to the Holsteins. Dressing percentage was greater for beef on Holsteins compared to Holsteins, and it was also greater for those fed less corn silage than those fed more corn silage, as we can see here. And moving on to ribeye area, this was not different between diets. However, it was greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. It was 25% bigger for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, showing us that, again, if we add beef genetics to these cattle, we can get more muscling. Fat thickness was also greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. And KPH was lower for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, but this may have been also a result of the cattle being harvested at different plants. So overall, we saw that yield grade was lower for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. And like I mentioned previously, if we remember, yield grade being lower means that there was more yield and more muscling, which is shows us that this greater ribeye area effectively helped us reduce this number in the yield grade score, and they had a greater yield. As for carcass empty body fat, similar to our first study, we were aiming to harvest these cattle at a similar compositional basis. And in this case, we were aiming for 30 to 31%. However, the Holsteins on the 40% diet had a lower carcass empty body fat, which is why they were statistically different. However, this did not seem to affect marbling score or quality grade that greatly, as this was fairly similar. There were no statistical differences, and they were on average modest, which in terms of quality grade was low to mid choice and was similar among breed types and treatments, as we can see here.
Pretty well.
Yeah.
As for our economic analysis, this table is also set up similarly to my previous table. As we can see, again, purchase cost in dollars per feeder calf was greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. This was actually $353 greater for the beef on Holsteins. So we overpaid again, just like last time. And this resulted in a greater interest on the cattle for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. As for our feed cost, in this case, we didn't have a starter diet, so it only includes pre-trial and finisher feed costs as well as interest on the feed. This resulted in a greater feed cost for the Holsteins compared to the beef on Holsteins. And this is, again, predominantly driven by the greater amount of days on feed. We also saw that those that were fed a 40% corn silage diet had a greater feed cost compared to those that had less corn silage in the diet. As for our non-feed operating cost, this is similar to our previous study. It included preventative health, medication, implants, yardage, transportation to harvest, beef checkoff, and in total, this resulted in the Holsteins having a greater non-feed operating cost compared to the beef on Holsteins, which again, this is predominantly driven by yardage, which is a direct result of the amount of days on feed. As for cost of gain, this was not statistically different. Even if we see some differences in the numbers here, statistically, this was not different. And moving on to our carcass pricing, even though in our first study, we looked at different pricing scenarios at the time of conducting this study, carcass pricing for beef on dairy cattle was more determined in a way. So beef on dairy cattle are being priced as beef. So we didn't necessarily look at a pricing scenario because that time it's when for our first study, we didn't know what that should be. Now we know what it should be. So we priced the Holsteins with the Holstein-based carcass price reported by USDA for those weeks of harvest, as well as the beef on Holsteins received the beef base carcass price reported by USDA on the week of harvest. We also included the premiums and discounts for that USDA had reported for those periods. And in this case, we have yield grades, quality grades, as well as the carcass weight discounts. We did not include the certified Angus beef one here because we didn't do the same type of pricing scenario. However, it is something that I am going to be looking at in the future. And so our tables or our graphs are set up a little bit differently here for carcass value because in the past we had pricing scenarios. In this case, we're comparing breed and diet. And as we can see with the beef on Holsteins in green and the Holsteins in gray, and those that were fed 40% or 20% in a lighter shade of green and gray, we saw that beef on Holsteins had a greater carcass value compared to the Holsteins. And this is predominantly driven by the differences in base carcass price. And when it comes to the carcass value by diet, this was greater for those that were fed less corn silage. And this is also a direct result of greater premiums due to greater quality grades. As for carcass revenue, this was also greater for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. However, it was not different between the diets. And for our break-even feeder calf value, we saw that the beef on Holsteins had, again, a greater break-even compared to the Holsteins. In this case, it's not important to look at it by diet, but yes, by breed, because this is how we bought them, by breed. And again, we saw that we should have paid $281 per calf more for the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins. However, we paid $353 more. So while it may not be as big of a difference that we saw with our first study, we still overpaid more than we should have for these calves. And while these studies show us that, yes, these beef on dairy bull calves should be priced at a premium over the Holsteins, it should not be as much as what we have been paying for them. And so to summarize both of these studies, in the first one, we saw that beef on Holsteins had a lower cost of gain, greater carcass value, and a greater break-even compared to their Holstein contemporaries. In our second project, we saw that if we feed more corn silage in the diet, we can reduce liver abscess incidence in both breed types without increasing cost of gain. And beef on Holstein cattle had a greater carcass value, revenue, and break-even compared to Holstein cattle. And I would like to acknowledge the Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture for funding these trials, as well as Zoetis and Merck for funding some of our other things we did in these studies, and the MSU Beef Center for keeping my cattle alive, because without cattle, I could not have done these studies and be showing you this data today. And so we have some ongoing research. So out of that second study, we collected rumen and intestine samples, as well as liver samples, so that we can look at how to understand rumen health, gut health, and liver health in beef on dairy cattle, and how to maybe adjust their diets so that we can have less liver issues and gut issues in them. And we also have another ongoing study where we're comparing feedlot performance, carcass traits, and sensory characteristics of Simmental Angus Holstein steers, heifers, and Holstein steers and beef steers. And for this study, we are almost done with our harvest. We just started with the heifers and we still have some groups to go. So I'm very excited to see where this is going to go and what more we're going to learn about these beef on dairy crosses. And with that, I would like to conclude and open the room to any questions.
Thank you very much, Melanie. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. Question is, the cost of medication was higher for crossbred calves. Do you have an explanation for this, since you would expect crossbreds to be healthier thanks to heterosis?
I believe that was during the first study, possibly.
Correct.
So I'm gonna try to go back to show that table, but That was because in that study, I believe that we had more health issues in the beef on Holsteins compared to the Holsteins, because in the second one, we didn't really have any issues. But that is something that when I was completing my master's, I also thought, I think that's here. So when I was completing my master's, I also thought that because of federosis, they should be expected to be healthier. There are some studies that have looked into this. A lot of them have not really seen any differences statistically. So while I understand that that's something that you would expect, I also would have expected that. But in that case, that is what we saw. And so we had to treat some beef on Holsteins a little bit more than the Holsteins. But I know that some research shows that there are not differences between crossbred and Holstein calves when it comes to health.
Thank you. I've failed to introduce my cohort from Minnesota, Jim Salfer, who will also be helping wrangle some questions here. Would note there on that slide you were just at that the yardage
Oh,
feed or yardage fee was higher for the Holsteins. Are we seeing some handling issues with dairy versus the beef and dairy?
if we've seen handling,
Yeah.
um,
Or why is the
so
yardage fee higher?
So our yardage was $1 per steer per day. So it was greater for the Holsteins because they were on feed for a longer period.
Fred, I've got a question. So what's your recommendation? Feed a higher corn silage diets. We've got issues with this. I'm hiring you as a highly paid consultant. So what is your recommendation on how to feed my purebred Holsteins versus my crossbreds? And you can throw in there purebred colored cattle too, if you want. I know there's a lot of different breeds of those that feed differently.
So I would say that for beef on dairy crosses and the Holsteins, they do need to be fed diets that have a greater amount of raw fish and fiber. It seems to help with their gut issues because we've seen that the liver abscess problem is big, and that was a big concern at the time of us starting this study. That's why we did it. We know that several groups did research because they were concerned about liver abscess development, and we know that this is the liver abscesses can happen because of many or any reasons, but it's predominantly because of diet and rumen issues. And so if we feed them more fiber in the diet, more corn silage or whatever raw fish option you have, it may be better for them in terms of gut health. And we didn't really see any detrimental differences in terms of performance or carcass.
Any other questions? Folks can go ahead and get them typed in to the chat box. Did you find any differences between the beef breeds that were crossed? I mean, we kind of been lumping them
No.
as beef on dairy, but did you find any differences?
So for our first study, for our second study, I have not looked at that. For the first study, even though I don't have that here, we did do, Dr. Oboric and I did a little bit of a small analysis looking at them, and the ones that had higher Angus genetics had the greatest performance, better marbling. However, when it comes to more yield and muscling, it was the ones that were Limousin Angus crosses. I don't have that here, but I do remember that. I'm just trying to get to the percentages of, yes. So the Limousin and Limousin Angus crosses had a greater muscling or yield, and those that were Angus had better quality grades. But in performance, they were all fairly similar.
Good.
I see that there's a question about implant strategy. For our first study before things changed, we had implemented a roll grow and Revolor IS implant strategy, and we
Melanie, you seem to have froze up a little bit. Well, it looks like she is in fact froze. Dan, while she logs off and logs back on, would you be able to handle that? We do have several questions here.
sorry, the meeting kicked me out for a second.
Okay, very good. You were talking about the implant strategy?
Yes, so let me show the PowerPoint again. So for our first study, it was Fragro followed by Revolor IS, and for the second one, it was Choice followed by one feedlot. With Synovex Choice and Synovex one feedlot.
Okay. We have a question from Paul. Any Charlet on Holstein cross data? We're seeing $1,100 day-old beef on dairy calves in our area recently.
Was it if we have any Charolais cross? We do not. We don't have Charolais cross data. I do know that Dr. Smith out of South Dakota State is doing some research on Charolais crosses, but we don't have that, or we haven't observed any Charolais crosses.
Okay. Roger, if you want to unmute and just ask your question directly, I'm not certain I'm getting the gist of it.
Should have been value, not val.
Okay. Do you see that, Melanie?
I see it. I do not have an answer to that right now. However, I will write down the question and get back to you on it, but I do not have an answer to that right now.
There are many producers that do not have corn silage that feed these cattle, so we'll use ground grass hay as a roughage source.
I know that some producers do that, but I am not. I
Okay.
don't want to give you an answer to that right now because I don't necessarily know right now.
Okay,
But I will get back to you on that.
thank you.
To kind of help us drill down on your corn silage, was it conventional genetics or BMR?
I believe so.
Good. Jim, are you seeing any questions out there or have any thoughts?
Oh,
Okay. Melanie, you talked a little bit about your uh, upcoming research. Anything else you want to kind of as a parting comment?
I have not been able to analyze any data yet, but I know that someone was asking about the heifers when we were chatting briefly about it. And I can definitely say that yes, because they were talking about if they went to harvest earlier than the crosses. That was the case for us. We just harvested some heifers. We are going to take the crossbred steers to harvest in a few weeks, around a month. So The heifers definitely finish earlier. They are fatter, or at least that's what it seems like. Obviously, we have not looked at these crosses yet, but they were very fat, really nice quality grades, not the greatest yield, which makes sense. But we have not been able to take our other cattle to harvest yet, so I don't have much to say about that. Um, but I can tell you that I'm very excited to see that data and share it with you in the future.
Very good. Okay, since I'm not seeing any questions come through on chat, I'll thank you for the presentation and remind folks that the Beef on Dairy Dialogue is a monthly webinar. Next month, Dr. Smith from South Dakota State will be talking about implant strategies for us. Thank you again. Look forward to having you back with us next month.